ਗੁਰ ਚਰਨ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਬਸ ਰਹੇ ਹਿਰਦੈ ਗੁਰ ਚਰਨ ਪਿਆਰੇ.
Hello, welcome to Lecture 15 of Introduction to the Sikhs. In this lecture, we'll talk about the global migration of the Sikh community. And in some sense, this topic motivates the whole course. One wouldn't have a course on Sikhs in Western academia if it weren't for the fact that Sikhs are now a global presence. Here's a map which is from 2004, but it's still representative of patterns of Sikh migration and presence. Most of the Sikh community is, of course, still in India. There aren't necessarily very accurate estimates, but one can guess at about 25 million Sikhs worldwide, and over 20 million of them would be in India, and most of those in Punjab. You can see that the arrows of migration lead to Great Britain or the United Kingdom, and then also to Canada, the United States, and several countries which were at some stage or other part of the British Empire or British Commonwealth. And that includes Australia and New Zealand, Malaysia, and the East Africa, including particularly Kenya and Uganda, which were British colonies. You can also see some migration paths to other countries in Western Europe. Italy seems to be after Britain seems to be the favored destination for Sikhs, and I'll touch on that briefly later, perhaps. But you can also see that there are a few Sikhs in Pakistan. At one time, there were Sikh communities in Afghanistan and even Iran, but those have almost disappeared. Another country which was not a British colony, which has a Sikh presence, is Thailand. So before I go into some of the details of global migration, and what I'll be able to do is give you some vignettes rather than a complete picture of the Sikh community's migration, since it's such a large topic. I want to frame the subject, and there are debates about terminology. One, of course, is between the terms migration and diaspora. And diaspora, of course, comes from a very specific context of the history of the Jewish community, but it has now become much more widely applied. And I think that broader usage is quite justified. But an even broader term, of course, is migration. And some of the distinctions rest on motives for moving location and the nature of the environments that create those pushes and pulls. Those can include economic factors, but very often the driving force is actually escaping from human rights abuses or other threats to survival. So that's a complicated issue, and one can discuss the terminologies further. But I think both terms in context are useful. Another very important aspect of framing is the distinction between Sikh and Punjabi. And Sikhs are primarily a religious community, but one sees that depending on the circumstances, they can get classified in different ways. In Great Britain in the, I think, 1970s, a court ruled that Sikhs could be treated as a race for purposes of application of the British Race Relations Act. And again, that has some problematics to it if one thinks of race as biological. On the other hand, if race is a social construct, then there's no issue. Similar factors emerging in the 2020 U.S. Census, where Sikhs have won the right to be classified as a separate ethnic group rather than being submerged in the much broader and heterogeneous category Asian Indian. Again, one can debate that the appropriateness of that, but certainly one can make positive arguments either way. Punjabi, on the other hand, is very much a cultural regional designation. And as I noted earlier, most Sikhs live in Punjab, and even the ones who are now in other parts of India or other countries, almost all of them originally, their forebears came from Punjab. So there's a lot of overlap between the terms Sikh and Punjabi in terms of who it applies to. Nevertheless, I think there's a strong case to focus on the term Sikh, because Sikh adds a very specific religious and cultural dimension, which goes well beyond the term Punjabi. And in the broader context, I would argue that Punjabi Hindus and Punjabi Muslims have significant differences, both in terms of religion and also with respect to some cultural practices that make the term Sikh applicable. Some scholars have argued that Sikhs themselves, when they were migrating, did not have consciousness of themselves as Sikh and rather thought of themselves as Punjabi. I think this represents actually a lack of knowledge or understanding of Sikh history. And certainly many migrants viewed themselves as Punjabi, and if a migrant community consisted mostly of Sikhs, but also some Hindus and Muslims, the term Punjabi was a natural inclusive designation, and small communities would seek that broader designation. Just as in another example, in the United Kingdom, people from India, Pakistan, and so on have sought the designation South Asian as a definition of broader community for political purposes, even though there are religious, cultural, and socioeconomic differences throughout that group. So I would argue that the scholars who think that Sikh is a recent self-identification are making an error. The next set of terms, assimilation, accommodation, acculturation, I think are important, in terms of thinking about the subject. Assimilation was often viewed as an ideal for immigrants, and that, of course, coincided with the use of the term melting pot for a country like the United States. I think there's really now a different approach to what it means to, for example, be American in terms of what aspects of identity are retained from the home country. And in that respect, I would argue that assimilation is not necessarily an ideal that should be imposed from outside or should be aspired to by different minority communities. So an alternative term is accommodation, and a slightly more technical term related to that is acculturation. Actually, accommodation means where both sides, the host culture and society and the culture and society representing the migrants, work out a modus vivendi, and we'll look at specific examples of that, especially when we look at California examples. Acculturation, I think, is in some ways somewhere in between accommodation and assimilation. And again, I think it's a relatively technical term, but when we come to looking at examples, I think we'll be able to illustrate it more precisely. Finally, there's one more academic dichotomy which I want to address: cosmopolitan versus transnational. And this was actually posited in the context of Europe and migrant and host populations there, but going back as far as, for example, the Jewish community in late 19th, early 20th century Europe. But recently it's also been applied to the history of Sikhs, particularly in California. Again, I think it's been misapplied, and its usage has been based on, I think, a misreading both of Sikh history in Punjab in the late 19th and early 20th century, but also a misunderstanding of the kinds of societal pressures and responses that existed in California. So I would argue that this distinction between cosmopolitan and transnational is actually misleading. So now let's look at some examples, and this will give a feel of some of the different aspects of Sikh migration and the Sikh diaspora. So I'll start out with the British Empire more broadly. This photograph is of one of the first Sikh migrants to Canada, and his introduction to Canada was as a soldier serving in the British Indian Army and participating in Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. This involved a global display of the power and breadth of the British Empire, and subjects from many different countries, typically military subjects, were then paraded around different colonies and members of the British Empire. So that's what, in some sense, led to one of the first exposures of Sikhs to global migration opportunities. This picture is of Sikh soldiers serving in World War I, and they're being greeted by some of the residents. This, I think, is from Britain. This photograph, but obviously Sikhs spent a lot of their time serving on the battlefields of France and Belgium in World War I, and they were a significant part of a very large British Indian Army that fought against the Axis powers for the First World War. Interestingly, just as a contemporary cultural reference, there is as a sort of symbolic representation of this presence, there's a Sikh soldier in the recent movie 1917, though the protagonists there are all white. Here's a photograph from between the two world wars, and this is a time of migration of Indians from British India to British East Africa, where they worked on the railroads and also served as traders and in other artisan occupations as well. And this was not exclusively a Sikh population. In fact, a large number of these transplanted workers were from the western state of Gujarat, but this is a pattern which began with there's many antecedents to this kind of use of indentured labor throughout history, and there are still examples of that in the Middle East, but this was a very important part of the British Empire. Here's a photograph again of immigrants or workers who were brought to British East Africa between the world wars from India, and again, a large number of them are Sikhs. This is actually a photograph of a Sikh Gurdwara in the city of Makindo in modern-day Kenya. And this has the Sikh or Khalsa symbol, the khanda, on its walls. It also has the opening of the Guru Granth Sahib on the front, and then it notes that this is a Gurdwara of the Singh Sabha in Makindo. And the Singh Sabha, if you remember, was an organization that started in the late 19th century as a response to British colonialism to reform Sikh society and strengthen it as a counterbalance to the effect of colonialism. And in Punjab and India itself, it became somewhat subsumed in the larger, broader Akali movement, the Akali Dal, which was a mass movement. But the designation Singh Sabha has persisted in terms of defining the community and also its Gurdwaras. Finally, this is a photograph from World War II showing some Sikh soldiers with some two young, I assume, British children. And this is, I guess, during the British Army's campaign against the Germans in North Africa. I should also note, going back to the previous photograph, that you can see in that there are, the photograph shows women and children, or complete families. Many photographs are just of males because they were often the first migrants and often the only migrants. And of course, in the case of soldiers, at this period, there would be only males. Now I'd like to turn to some illustrations from North America, in particular Canada and the US, and starting with British Columbia and the first Sikh look at that region. It's really the West Coast that was the place where initial Sikh migrants came. And the total numbers were relatively small until there was actually severe restrictions introduced on migration, which I'll talk about in my next lecture. So this is a very early photograph, I think just after the turn of the century, around 1903, and this shows British lumber workers Sikh lumber workers in British Columbia. And this is one of very few archival photos from that time and place. Again, this is a photograph of Indians working in the northwestern lumber industry. And again, they're mostly Sikhs. There were a smattering of Hindus and Muslims, but by far the largest number, maybe 80-90%, were Sikhs. And they started in the lumber industry, but then they migrated south into other agricultural occupations. This is a photograph of the first Sikh Gurdwara in the United States, and this is the original Gurdwara building in Stockton, California, somewhat slightly east of the San Francisco Bay Area. Somewhat earlier, Gurdwara was erected or formed in Abbotsford, British Columbia, not too far from the city of Vancouver, again centered in an agricultural region. I think that building still survives, and it's somewhat used, but mostly a museum. I don't think this building exists anymore. It's been replaced by a brick building which was built in the 1920s. This photograph comes from around 1914, I think. This is a picture of Sikhs, also, I believe, from Stockton. And this is from around 1945, shortly before Indian independence from Britain. And you can see this is a parade, and there's some evidence of signifying patriotism. And you can see that Sikhs are dressed very much in Western clothes, though, and that's been typical of South Asian migration, where men have tended to adopt Western clothes more quickly, whereas women have tended more to wear traditional clothing, salwar kameez, which is loose trousers and long shirt, and sometimes saris. So sari is not really a traditional Punjabi outfit, but more from other parts of India. In any case, one sees similar patterns, for example, in post-World War II Japan in terms of the adoption of dress. Here is a photograph from the First World War, and this is Bhagat Singh Thind, who I will talk about a little later in more detail. But Bhagat Singh Thind was, again, an early Sikh migrant and volunteered for and served in the U.S. Army. The U.S., of course, entered World War I in 1917. So unlike a large presence in the British Indian Army, as far as I know, he was the only Sikh to serve in the U.S. Army, and this had some interesting repercussions in terms of his future. Of course, he was not a citizen at the time. Finally, here's another Sikh who represents a different life story. This is Dalip Singh Sond, and he is here shown photographed in front of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. In fact, Sond was the first, not only the first Sikh to serve in the U.S. Congress, but also the first South Asian American and the first Asian American to serve in the U.S. Congress. And his story was very different from that of the migrant laborers. He actually came as a mathematics student to UC Berkeley. He actually got a doctorate and nevertheless faced considerable discrimination. He tried to assimilate, but it was obviously a long process. He was able to marry a white woman, which was difficult, if not impossible, at the time. And according to the laws of that time, she actually lost her U.S. citizenship by marrying him. Nevertheless, he became a judge and successfully ran for the U.S. Congress from the Imperial Valley in the southern part of California near the Mexican border. And the story is that he was able to really frame himself as very much an American, and his campaign posters, for example, just referred to him as Judge Sond. So the Indianness of his name was minimized. Things have changed somewhat since then, and I'll talk about that a little later in the lecture. So now turning to Britain, perhaps the most famous Sikh migrant to Britain was an involuntary migrant, and that was Dalip Singh, one of the sons of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And the older sons had first succeeded Maharaja Ranjit Singh, but had been killed in the struggles after his death. And Dalip Singh was just, I think, 9 years old and became the ruler with his mother Jind Kaur Jindan Kaur as the regent. But once the British defeated the Sikhs in 1849 and annexed Punjab, Jindan Kaur was banished to Nepal, exiled to Nepal, and Dalip Singh was taken away from his mother and brought to Britain, where the attempt was to then bring him up as an English gentleman. He cut his hair, converted to Christianity, and lived on a country estate. Later in life, though, he rediscovered his Sikh heritage. He grew a beard and turban, tried to go back to India to meet with his mother, but was prevented from doing so. He did marry an Egyptian woman, had several children, but none of them had heirs, so that line has disappeared. This is the house in London where Dalip Singh lived. He also lived on a country estate, and I believe he lived here for about 5 years, in this London house for about 5 years in the 1880s. This is a photograph from post-World War II, so a little bit of history. Britain certainly won the Second World War in alliance with the United States and France, of course, the Free French. but it was economically very badly hit. And as it recovered, there was a need for cheap labor to man the factories of Britain, and as post-war growth accelerated. And again, a lot of the early migrants came from regions which had close ties with the British Empire. And this is a group of Sikh men in, I think, a Midlands town in Britain. A lot of these factories were in the British Midlands, like places like Birmingham and Coventry. Here's another photograph. This, again, is all male, but you see some children, which reminds us that actually at this stage, these immigrants were able to bring their families over. This is actually a photograph of the Batra community. Again, this is a clan or subcaste. And this illustrates another facet of migration, which is typical of many migrations, different countries, communities, time periods, where ethnic networks, community networks are very important for information flows and then for supporting migrants as they come to a new place and make new lives. So this is, I guess, a celebration or marking of the presence of that community in Britain. This is probably the 1950s. So by the 1960s, Sikhs were numerous and prominent enough to start to try to become recognized as more full-fledged citizens of Britain. And this newspaper story and photograph remind us of some of the unique aspects of being a Sikh. Turban Sikhs wanted to be able to serve as bus conductors and drivers. I think the city in this case was Manchester, though similar issues came up in other cities. And they wanted to do this without giving up their beards and turbans. And eventually, after protests and campaigns, the British authorities relented. There was at this time somewhat of a backlash, and this is the late 1960s is the first time one saw right-wing anti-immigration politicians rising to prominence in Britain. Of course, we've seen a reprise of that with Brexit, and even in the late 70s and early 80s, one saw also a lot of not only immigrant unrest at discrimination, but also backlash in terms of police overreaction and right-wing politics. This is very interesting. This is actually just a nondescript row house in London, in Western London. But this was actually the site of the first Gurdwara in London in Shepherd's Bush. And the community just used this house. Later, they were able to convert or build a dedicated building. So here you can see some of the architectural features of Sikh Gurdwaras. There is a fairly muted restrained dome at the top center. And then rather than domes at the corners, you can see sort of these semi-domes symbolic at the front entrance. And you can see also the flagpole with the Sikh flag, the Nishan Sahib. So this, I think this Gurdwara is still there in Shepherd's Bush. Now, of course, the largest Sikh Gurdwaras are in a suburb further west of London, Southall, and there are several Gurdwaras there, and a very large concentration of Sikh population in Southall. Again, Sikhs in contemporary Britain are much more of an accepted presence, and this reflects a more multicultural approach to British identity, though again one sees ebbs and flows. It's interesting, for example, that there are a couple of prominent South Asians in the current British cabinet, which at the same time has a relatively xenophobic approach to governance. So now I'm going to go back in time and back to the northwestern United States, and we'll look at a series of vignettes describing some aspects of Sikh experience in particular, though again there were a few Hindus and Muslims in these circumstances, but most of the Asian Indian community at the time in these regions was Sikh. So the Bellingham Riots of 1907. Bellingham is a small town or city in the state of Washington, not too far from the Canadian border. It was, again, a lumber town at the time, and so it was a natural place for Sikhs who were first showing up in British Columbia as part of the British Empire. They started to move south into the state of Washington. These are some of just a formal photograph of some of these early Sikh workers, and again, wearing their best Western clothes for the formal photograph. This is a lumber mill in Bellingham at the time. These are all archival photos from the period. And this shows the response. You can see the headline very clearly. We have a dusky peril, and you can see the representation of the threatening foreigners wearing turbans and beards. So some of the representations and responses that we've seen after the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979-80 or after 9/11 have a history in some of the responses in the early 20th century to migration by people who look different and were viewed as culturally unacceptable. Again, often at the time, the community was just described as Hindus, and this was used for all inhabitants of South Asia, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh. And I think this does not imply in any way that there were no, as I've said earlier, there was no boundaries between the communities. The three different communities recognized themselves as distinct, even at the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. They saw themselves as Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh. In many cases, of course, they also saw themselves as Punjabi. But the term Hindu applied to them was more just a reflection of the ignorance of the host population. Again, this is another story which talks about the threat coming from these Hindus and how they need to be dealt with. This is the aftermath of the Bellingham Riots, so let me describe what happened. There were a few hundred lumber workers, and anti-immigrant sentiment was swelling. One night in 1907, a mob formed and basically chased all the South Asians, mostly Sikhs, out of their dorms and barracks where they were living while working in the lumber industry. And they basically had to flee the town in the middle of the night. Some of them tried hiding in different parts of town, but were caught, and they left town by foot or however they could get out. And this shows actually some of the community waiting at the platform of the railway station in the morning, waiting to leave. So they were left alone except for being jeered at by the mob. So this is an episode which is maybe not well known, but I think it's an important episode in the history of immigration to the United States. And one can find similar, discriminatory episodes for other Asian immigrants, for immigrants from Japan and China as well. I think this was a significant one for South Asians who were mostly Sikh. Another very important incident concerns the Kamagata Maru, and this is in 1914. The Kamagata Maru was a Japanese flagged vessel, hence the name. And the story behind this is that as Sikhs began to migrate to British Columbia, again, there was an anti-immigrant response. There were attempts to control the migration. Because the Sikhs were subjects of the British Empire, it was legally somewhat tricky to do that. One law was passed which required the vessel to have made a continuous passage from India or from wherever they were coming in order to be able to dock in and let off its passengers in the harbor in Vancouver or Victoria. Before the Kamagata Maru, there was another ship with a small contingent of Sikhs, and they were allowed to land and come ashore and become residents. But this led to the agitation and legal measures. And when the Kamagata Maru came with several hundred Sikhs on board, the response was very different. The authorities refused to let it dock. The ship was forced to stay in the harbor. And you can see here some of the passengers. Again, they are almost all Sikhs, and they're, again, wearing their best clothes for the journey, Western suits, looking very inoffensive. And the conditions were actually much worse than that photograph might describe. You can see that they were really crowded onto the ship, on the decks and below deck and so on, probably worse than the steerage on the lower decks of the Titanic that you might have seen in the movie. Anyway, they had endured a long journey, but were refused entry, and ultimately had to sail back to India, where actually they were brutalized by the police in British India. The pictures are quite a contrast to the headline, which says Hindu invaders now in the city harbor on Kamagata Maru. So again, I wanted to contrast the nature of the rhetoric with the actual people who were being demonized here. Another very important aspect of early Sikh migration is the Gada movement, which was founded in 1913, originally actually among Sikhs, mostly Sikhs working in the lumber industry in Oregon, but very quickly it became headquartered in the city of San Francisco, and this was in 1913. The active movement really only lasted a few years and petered out shortly after the First World War, but the Gada party itself was not formally wound up till 1948. Gada itself means revolution. It's spelled in different ways, sometimes without the H, sometimes without the second A. But it reflected several different threads of consciousness. One was the Indian independence movement, but there was also a very strong general anti-imperialist thread. This was, of course, a time of general spread of ideas that ultimately came from communism. And these revolutionary ideologies were obviously very threatening to the imperial regimes of Europe. In particular, of course, as we know, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in Russia in 1917 and established the Soviet Union shortly thereafter. So this was a very tumultuous time. The other threads that I think were important here were the ideal of American independence, which emphasized freedom and equality, and of course that aligned very well with the campaign for independence of India. In fact, the founding of the Gada movement precedes the real direct demand for independence in India itself. Initially, the Indian National Congress, Gandhi and Nehru and so on, had just made demands or requests for home rule, some degree of autonomy, and full independence came later. So in some sense, the members of the Ghadar movement were pioneers in that respect in terms of leading the Indian freedom movement. The fourth strand, though, of the Ghadar movement was actually the large Sikh presence. And while the Ghadar party was non-religious, because a large number of Sikhs participated in it, there were close connections with the Sikh community in the Stockton Gurdwara, which I've talked about earlier, and the organization there, the Pacific Coast Khalsa Diwan, which was not at all revolutionary, much more focusing on making Sikhs an accepted part of American society. But the ideals of equality and social justice were obviously very consistent between the revolutionaries and Sikh ideals. So this building here is the original Ghadar headquarters in San Francisco. This building is no longer extant, but there's a modern building on that site which has a small plaque marking the Ghadar movement. And it's been very much co-opted by the current Indian government and framed as part of the Indian freedom movement. But also, as I've said, there were aspects of anti-imperial revolutionary ideology and American ideals and also Sikh ideals that made up part of the Ghadar movement. Several of the leaders of the Ghadar movement came from among the student population, and many of these were students who had come to UC Berkeley to study. So UC Berkeley's reputation as a center of revolutionary change goes way before the free speech movement of 1964. In fact, the Ghadar movement in 1913 really owes its roots to the presence of these students at UC Berkeley. You can see they're holding a banner which says Hindustan, a term for India, and the students are, again, they're a mix of Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims. This is the Ghadar party flag, and here are some prominent leaders of the Ghadar party. The names are in Punjabi, and I won't recite them, but they include Sikhs. Actually, there are 3 Sikhs, a Hindu, and a Muslim in this group, and they were among the most prominent leaders of the party. The party itself suffered some schisms, and they were actually the subjects of a trial. I think it was called the German conspiracy trial in San Francisco. A very large number were tried in San Francisco in the United States. There was also arrests and trials in British India, and in British India, several members of the Ghadar party were executed by hanging around this time. So by 1917, the time of the San Francisco trial, the Ghadar party was already being suppressed and pretty much crushed. This is this is actually a photograph of members of the Ghadar party who were executed by the British Indian authorities. And again, there are many Sikhs among this group. So again, these are the heading uses the term martyrs, and Sikhs certainly view the members of the Ghadar party who lost their lives as being very much in the tradition of Sikh martyrdom. So now we'll come back to Bhagat Singh Thind. If you remember, he enlisted and served in the in the U.S. Army in World War I, and interestingly, he was allowed to serve with his beard and turban. The kinds of restrictions which have now been imposed in the U.S. Army were introduced actually mostly after World War II in terms of so-called grooming guidelines and so on. At that time, Thind had no problem serving. This is a description of the probably one of the most important or at least famous cases in U.S. Immigration history. Bhagat Singh Thind applied to be a U.S. citizen. He was granted citizenship by a local judge, but the U.S. Immigration Service appealed. It was turned down. It was basically then reversed. His citizenship was taken away after a few days. He applied again was turned down. And I think it was on his third try, which came decades later, that he finally succeeded in becoming a U.S. citizen. The case itself is quite complicated because Thind's argument, which his South Asian lawyer tried to use, was that while there was a law against, at this stage, non-whites becoming U.S. citizens, especially non-whites from Asian countries, the lawyer argued that Thind was actually Caucasian and therefore white, and the judge's ruling was well, maybe he's Caucasian, but he's not white as we understand it. So it really is a very interesting illustration of how race is used to support particular power structures. Thind's side is also not kind of perfect in this respect, because some of the arguments that Thind's lawyer used were actually very racist arguments towards racial minorities from Africa. So I think it's really a window into some of the worst aspects of racial attitudes and politics of the time. Thind actually went on to have a very successful career as a spiritual teacher. This is a small category of entrepreneurship which emerged in, I guess, the late 19th century and flourished through the early and mid-20th century. There was interest in Hindu and more generally Eastern philosophy and spirituality, in yoga and so on, and several enterprising immigrants or visitors from India or South Asia set themselves up as spiritual teachers. Thind actually had, again, a doctorate, I think from UC Berkeley, but he pursued a successful career as a spiritual teacher, and he lived to actually a ripe old age. I think he passed away in 1967 in his 70s, and here is a picture of Thind as a young man, as an old man, and as a contrast to him serving as a soldier in his early 20s. I believe the family of Bhagat Singh Thind still maintains a website where you can read about his life and legacy. And so again, he's in different ways, I think, a significant figure in the history of minorities and immigrants in the United States. Illustrations of Sikhs in contemporary North America and Britain in particular. This is a photograph of a Sikh policeman in Britain from maybe a decade or two ago. Again, Sikhs have not had difficulty since some of the struggles of the 1960s in terms of serving in the military or police forces and so on, wearing their turbans and beards. And again, some of that reflects the larger presence of Sikhs in Britain, but also the colonial history where the British government has some knowledge and connection to the Sikh community. I think all the examples I'm going to show you are actually those of turbaned, and in the case of males, bearded Sikhs. And that's because I want to show you examples of Sikhs fitting in without changing their external appearance, and that illustrates some of the contrast between assimilation and accommodation that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. So this is not to say that all Sikhs have beards and turbans. Certainly most Sikh women do not wear turbans, and many Sikh men have assimilated or adapted by cutting their hair in particular, though sometimes they will keep beards. This is a Sikh soldier. You can tell this is Canada because there's a Mountie alongside him, and this is a visit by Queen Elizabeth to Canada. There's a side story here that Sikhs actually did have to agitate in Canada to be allowed to serve in the Mounties with their turbans, and there was, again, some opposition from so-called traditionalists and some in the Mounties themselves. But eventually the Sikh side of it was accepted, and I don't know how many Sikhs there are in the Mounties, but they're allowed to serve wearing turbans rather than the distinctive Mountie hat. This is, again, a Sikh family, basically European American or Western converts to Sikhism and their children. And I mentioned this group, the 3HO, briefly in an earlier lecture. This is a photograph of a family, and you can see one way that they've asserted their membership of this group after conversion is to have a full-fledged adoption of the Khalsa identity, and this includes the women everybody wearing turbans, including the women, and also wearing Indian dress. The men and boys are wearing the loose trousers and long shirts. Very often they'll wear white, but in this case the boys are wearing blue. I think the presence of this community, while very small in numbers, in just the hundreds of thousands, I think is a very significant aspect of Sikh presence in the United States in particular, and the diaspora more generally. And I'll talk about them again in a future lecture. The others are isolated examples of Sikhs, again, seeking to fit in while maintaining their identity. This is a Sikh who was allowed to play for the University of Oregon football team wearing a turban. Obviously, the turban is wrapped tightly enough so that a helmet would fit over it. And here's a Sikh basketball player playing for Trinity University. In his case, again, he had to get a special exemption to be allowed to wear a turban. This was something that came up later, where the Federation, International Basketball Associations, was petitioned and ultimately relented to allow Sikhs to wear some head covering while playing basketball. This is actually a very well-known Sikh, and I'll mention his name, Fauja Singh, and he's famous for running marathons into his 90s, and here he's pictured very iconically in front of the U.S. Capitol building, like the previous photograph of Dalip Singh Sond. But in this case, I think it represents a different aspect of belonging, not in Congress, but just being part of the fabric of American life. And I think Fauja Singh is the oldest person ever to run a marathon. And again, he likes to run wearing his turban. This is the leader of the Canadian opposition. Again, something quite notable. In Canada, you've had turban Sikhs serving in high government positions. Something that hasn't happened in the U.S. The highest position that turbaned politicians have reached in the U.S. is mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey, and I think attorney general in the state of New Jersey. But some of that reflects, I think, again, Canada's history as part of the British Empire, a larger number in absolute terms of Sikhs in Canada, also a much larger fraction of the population. The concentration of Sikhs in British Columbia in particular has also given Sikhs more political representation and power, and several Sikhs have been serving in the cabinet of Justin Trudeau. Here's a Sikh woman who became the first turbaned Sikh to serve as a judge in a Canadian court, I think in British Columbia. And again, this is to round out the picture. Here's a woman who, again, a Western convert to Sikhism, who was serving in the Canadian Navy and petitioned and was successfully and was allowed to wear her turban as a serving member of the Canadian Navy. So again, I've chosen pictures of turbaned Sikhs to not because they're the only Sikhs, but to illustrate how Sikhs have sought to not separate themselves from society, but to participate fully in the societies where they are now members, and yet do that without giving up what they see as an important part of their heritage and identity. Again, this illustrates the ideal of accommodation, mutual accommodation, rather than the old message of total assimilation.